Good morning, everyone. I take it it's morning where everyone is. Everyone see my slides?
Yep, they are coming through perfectly.
Okay, great. So today's session is really about Azure Information Protection. It's new, but it's not so new, so we're going to go through that. Microsoft tends to throw a lot of terms at us that confuses everyone. We've seen it with SharePoint around teams and team sites and Office 365 groups, and it just becomes very confusing. And part of this session is also to dispel the myth behind the naming convention Azure Information Protection. Then we're also going to look at what it does, how other products roll up into it, and how the Microsoft product set works with that, because there's a couple of facets around that. So just some stuff about me. I've got to do a shameless punt. I'm an Office Service MVP. I'm an Nintex virtual technology evangelist. I look after productivity evangelism for Dimension Data in South Africa, and also for Dimension Data through the global channel. So we do a lot I work for a company called Brighthouse. It's a wholly owned by Dimension Data in South Africa. And we do work in the Americas and Asia Pacific Rim, as well as Middle East and Africa, out of South Africa. And we've got the flattest English in the world. So chances are East, West Coast, as well as Asia will definitely understand that. I've been working with enterprise content management tools since about 2000, if not earlier. I'm involved in SharePoint Saturday, as well as a user group lead in South Africa. And if you want to find me, just Google Alistair Pugin. It's Journeys and Gilbys, like my dad always used to say. Well, he still says that. And if you want to follow us, you can grab us at Two Guys and SharePoint. We've got a weekly podcast on all things Azure and Office 365. So let's jump right in. It's probably easier just to go through everything. People would know information protection as rights management or rights management services, or information rights management, or the old digital rights management with Windows Media Player back in the old days. And Microsoft is saying it's the wrong name. So how do you move past that? I mean, it's tricky, because people are still talking about rights management services. It's still a big thing. Microsoft brought out Azure Information Protection, and the world went crazy, because people were saying, well, what is that? Are they using the word Azure for the sake of using the word Azure? For those that have actually spun up the original Azure portals, which we'll still show today, rights management services has been there. It's always been there. So what is this thing called Azure Information Protection? So let's clear up the confusion. It's probably easier just to go through all the naming conventions. And funnily enough, I think it's my second last slide. There's a resource link in there that actually takes you to how to clear up the information that's been presented. So Azure Rights Management, we know about that. It's been around, or Azure Rights Management Services. Active Directory Rights Management Services in Azure, Azure AD Rights Management. Windows Azure Active Directory Rights Management Services. It's all the same thing. And what Microsoft's done, they've taken the stuff that they released in 2003 through Rights Management Services for Windows Server back in the day, and they've rolled it up into Azure Information Protection. But I'm sure that everyone is still confused. And usually this slide gets quite a bit of laughter, but I can't hear anyone, so I'm assuming everyone's laughing in the background. But we'll go with that. So it's still the same. For those that are new to rights management services, or rights management server, or Azure rights management, or Windows rights management, or information rights management from Microsoft, what it does is it locks down content in your organization. I don't know if anyone's worked with the old RMS stuff for Windows Server 2003 and subsequent versions of Windows Server. It's exactly the same. You still have the same functionality. What Microsoft's done now, well, they've extended it into Azure, and now you can run it straight from Azure, so you've got a single point of entry to manage rights management That's all it really is, and they've added additional functionality. So what you can still do, which you've been able to do since about, I think, was SharePoint, it was SharePoint 2007 that allowed you to enable rights management for SharePoint. You can now enable rights management for a multitude of Microsoft products. It's always been there for Office. So your Office suite, it's still there. It's the same thing. The client's changed a bit, but it still does the same thing. You can now also enable it across supported platforms or your mobile devices, which is great. Not that Windows Phone. I don't know how many people actually use Windows Phone currently. But yes, if you want to enable it for Windows Phone, you can. It's available for Mac. I don't think it was available in Office 2011, I'm not 100% sure, but it's available for Mac. The big question around that when it comes to OneDrive is Mac's just released a new file system for iOS, and that's pretty much where it comes into play, and you'll see how that works with OneDrive. So it runs on Android, it runs on iOS, it runs on Windows Phone. It does not run on Linux. I know Microsoft's a big Linux fan right now, so I mean I've got stickers that said Microsoft loves Linux and they're part of the Linux Foundation, but it hasn't been extended to your extension 3 file systems that you have with your typical distributions of Linux. And also you can then extend this to file servers. I don't know how many people are running file servers, but you can extend it, and you could always extend it to file servers. There's, I think it's called there's a file interconnect service, the FCI service, that allows you to enable it on file servers by the definition of file servers. And then obviously Exchange, you can enable it in Exchange, well, more or less not Exchange, but you're enabling it for Outlook through the Azure client, the Azure Information Protection client, and then other servers like SharePoint, which is, it's always been around, so you've got that functionality. So really, what Azure Information Protection, it gives you what it does for you. It gives you 5 control points. One is the user. So how do you lock down user content? Obviously users work inside of applications like Office, so Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook. So you can lock down content and embed that directly when users create content. That also extends to devices. Where there was an article published, I think it was 2 days ago, or was it last night? It might have been last night or this morning, around shadow IT and the percentage of users in organizations that add to shadow IT. Bring your own device has been around since the beginning of time. Companies are no longer issuing company cell phones. So how do you manage content, and how do you lock content down across multiple devices that you don't own? And one of the ways of doing that is through Azure Information Protection. Also at an application layer, so how do you lock it down when people are uploading content, or when people are using OneDrive, or when people are trying to send mail? How do you lock content at an application level? There's also location-based services. So you might find from a multinational organization, you've got different rules and regulations that apply. So when you start looking at applying policies to content that's sitting in your America's data centers versus the European data centers, different legalities apply, laws and legislations apply from country to country. We've seen the GDPR being hit heavily across multinational organizations, and that's funneling through from the European Union, and organizations in the Americas also have to subscribe to that if they have offices in that form part of the European Union states, for lack of a better word. And then also data sensitivity. You might find that data sensitivity is more important in your geolocated areas. So if you've got an Office 365 or an Azure data center in the US, it might have different policies that need to be applied to a data center sitting in Ireland, or the new data centers coming to South Africa. And just for the South Africans on the call, we are getting 3 different data centers in 2 different locations. So we're getting a Dynamics 365 data center, we're getting an Azure data center, and we're getting an Office 365 data center, and that will be in Johannesburg as well as Cape Town. So these things also apply to us, and it will be more relevant to South Africans as soon as they start rolling out those data centers mid 2018. So I want to jump into the various products that Azure Information Protection actually looks after, and I think the biggest one for everyone right now is OneDrive. OneDrive, everyone's gotten into it right now. OneDrive has become sexy again, it's become cool again with a new sync client for OneDrive, the next generation sync client for OneDrive. So let's have a look at how you work with OneDrive and Azure Information Protection. Don't worry, there's a couple of slides we're going to go through, and then I'm going to jump into a demo and show you how all of these things work. Remember, rights management services is object-based. When I say object, it's applied to a document, and Azure Information Protection supports, there are supported file types for what they call classification as well as protection. It supports all the Office file types, and we'll see how that works. So this is a two-edged sword. OneDrive's great for syncing, but OneDrive has got nothing to do with rights management services. Zero. OneDrive is a sync client. That's all it is. And also, when you're using OneDrive, Microsoft's dropped the OneDrive Personal or OneDrive for Business sentiment that they've carried on for the last couple of years. We actually talk about OneDrive, so it's OneDrive Personal or OneDrive Business. And the nice thing about Azure IP, it covers on-premise as well. So not only do you have the facility to use your OneDrive Personal content, you've also got OneDrive Business, which is not only extended to Office 365, but you can sync SharePoint libraries with SharePoint running in Azure, as well as SharePoint on-premise, and Azure IP covers on-premise as well. So if you've got a SharePoint on-premise version running in Azure or in your local data center in your office or in your basement in your office, you get rights management services or Azure IP protection extended to that as well. So OneDrive should be seen as something that rolls up into your Office protectors, and we'll talk about how Office protectors work. So back in the old days when you still had SharePoint Foundation, when the first version of rights management services or server released, when you had a server that you deployed and a client that you deployed, and it wasn't rolled up into the features of Windows Server, you had what they called Office protectors. And the basis of all Azure Information Protection is really on Office protectors. You've got a product that allows you to protect and lock down content in Word, in PowerPoint, in Excel, and all the Microsoft products as well, all the Microsoft Office products. That is also extended to images, so your typical JPEGs and your TIFFs and your GIFs and those things, you can lock down that, also text files and Adobe PDF. So you've got that full feature-rich functionality when it comes to what I like to term work objects in your organization. Bearing in mind that rights management service still needs to be activated, and it will take you to the old Azure portal, which I'll show you how to do. And when you start looking at Office 365, those are the SKUs that there are available for. Now, bearing in mind, if you spin up Office 365, depending on what plan you're on, you have Azure and access to the Azure portal without having to pay for it. Rights management services is one of those things. So default, if you've got Office 365, an E3 plan and up, an A3 plan and up, or for the government organization, the EDUs, you've got a G plan and up, you can actually go to portal.azure.com, log in with your credentials, and you're probably using Azure AD to sync your users across. You'd be able to access Azure Information Protection free of charge. There are different plans though. So for Azure IP, you've got plan 1 and plan 2, and we'll talk about that in a bit, but you'll be able to see that when you start working with Azure IP, it will tell you, well, you'll need plan 2 for this specific feature set in that. And that's really the OneDrive side. So don't stress or fret about OneDrive. OneDrive is a sync client. That's all it is. There are some caveats around that. And I know with the next generation sync client, if you ever went into your task manager and you look at what clients you're actually running, the old client was the Grieve.exe file. So in your task manager, you'll see Groove.exe running. And with the new one, you'll see the OneDrive.exe client running. And this is where the problem comes in with Microsoft saying, oh no, Azure Information Protection supports OneDrive. It does, but it doesn't work with the next generation sync client for OneDrive. It does not. So if you're running the latest one, which ships with Windows 10, and strangely enough, the next generation of the sync client, which is rolling out currently, only runs on Windows 10 when it comes to OneDrive files on demand feature. So there was talk about the OneDrive files on demand so that you don't have to sync that down, you can just view it. That is only available on Windows 10 with the latest Creators update. You can see where Microsoft is going with that to drive you to upgrade to Windows 10, and you're going to see over the next 9 to 12 months, a lot of the feature sets that are being released by Microsoft is only supported on Windows 10. So if you're running the next generation sync client, you're going to have to remove that and deploy the old sync client, which you'll see as group.exe, so that when you're syncing libraries from SharePoint for OneDrive, that you are able to utilize, that you can actually work with these Azure Information Protected documents. So let's have a look at how this applies to Office docs in general. Well, it also extends to PDFs as well as image files and text files. What you're going to have to do, like you did in the old days with RMS, you're going to have to download the Azure IP client, and it's going to replace the old RMS sharing client. Strangely enough, they actually released the RMS sharing client sometime this year, and then it was replaced with the new Azure IP client. So in order for you to enable that, you've got to download it. You can also deploy it via a group policy in your organization so that everyone now has Azure Information Protection client running on their desktops. And it's quite neat. Also, if you've got documents that are sitting in your file server and you want people to view it, but you don't, it's not necessarily an Office document, the nice thing about the client, it will actually allow you to view the content that way, and I'll show you how that works in a bit. It actually embeds directly into your Office applications. So when you open up Office, you'll be able to see that. I don't know if anyone remembers the document panel sits on the top. They've deprecated that in Office 2016. This forms part of that. So you don't have that rich information panel, but in this case with the Azure Information Protection client, you do have that functionality. And it gives the user a sense of ease because you can now, creating a blank Word document, you can apply a policy directly to it. You don't have to save it and then apply a policy. You can do it at document creation. What's new in Azure Information Protection compared to the old stuff is you've got this rich header, footer, and watermarks that can be applied depending on the policy that you're applying to the document. And that's a really, really cool feature that you have available now in Office. It's the old Office protectors. We've spoken about that. So anyone that's worked with those sort of things, it's great because you can now stop people from using snipping tools in general, not just the snipping tool that ships with Windows, but stuff like Snagit is also blocked so people can't sort of lasso information in a document and copy paste that somewhere else. It blocks all of those things. So when you start looking at working in Office, you won't be able to reply or forward documents, which is quite cool. And that view, edit, copy-paste contents also locked down through Office protectors. The supported file formats, we've spoken about that, Office docs, image and text files, as well as PDFs. And there's a list of documents, and you'll find that in the resource slide, of document protectors that are enabled by default, and you'll actually see how the file extensions change when you enable it. It prefixes, so if it's a docx, it will be a pdocx to say that it's a protected document. Bearing in mind that there are different Office versions, so from Office 2007 up, and I'm not too sure if, I think Office 2003 was still your doc and your XLS and your PPTs. It's only when Microsoft started working with open, I think it's an open document format, subscribe to that. So here's a nice trick for you working with anything older than Office 2003 versions of documents. Go to your Windows Explorer, grab a docx or a XLSX or a PPTX and rename it to a .zip, and you'll be able to see the XML content of the actual document. And that's how Microsoft started working with being able to protect and lock down content using Office protectors on the later versions of Office. Also, there are some file size limitations depending on the versions of Office that you're working with. I think the later versions to Office 2013 and Office 2016, you're limited to the file size on disk. So if it's a 2 gig, and I've seen, I think Michael Johnson's on the call and he'd be able to lay testament to this, working with clients that are running around with 2 gig Power Pivot Excel spreadsheets, building out on that, you'd still be able to lock down that content as well. So that pretty much covers Office Docs in its totality and how you can work with Office Docs when it comes to Azure IP. The other one that Microsoft's always touted, and we've only got 2 more to go before I take you through a demo, so don't fret about it. SharePoint. SharePoint you've always been able to enable rights management services or information rights management through SharePoint and suck that richness there. It's still the same, hasn't changed. This extends to SharePoint on-premise as well as SharePoint Online. You still have to enable it, and I'll show you how to do that in the demo. What's nice about this is when it comes to enabling rights management or Azure IP for, in SharePoint's case, it's not Azure IP, it's actually just rights management services. You can block content at a library level. So when a user wants to upload a document that cannot accept Office protection from Azure IP or RMS, the user will be told that this document, a policy cannot be applied to it via rights management services, and you are not allowed to upload that content to the specific library that has RMS enabled on it. So that's quite a nice feature so that you don't confuse the types of content that can be stored in a library that's actually sitting in SharePoint. Also, the policy only gets applied to the document once you are downloading the document or opening the document in Office Online. Now, also bearing in mind you've got Office Online Server, which is not online, it's actually an on-premise version of Office Online so that you can work with Word, Excel, and PowerPoint documents in the browser. This extends to Office Online as well, or Office Online Server. So the policy is actually applied when you interact with the document. So the minute you click on it to view it or download it, the document policy is actually applied at download. This is where I get really frustrated with Microsoft. So Azure IP creates policies. You cannot consume those policies that you've created in Azure IP in SharePoint because SharePoint uses the RMS features from Azure IP when working with document libraries. I've tested this as of a week ago and it's still the same. So if Microsoft's changed it in the last 4 days and haven't blogged about it, then I'm completely wrong. But traditional SharePoint, including SharePoint Online, consumes rights management services from Azure IP, and you will have to create that policy in SharePoint at a document library level. It's not utilized, it doesn't utilize the policies and the labels and the classifications that you create in Azure IP. It's a separate section. It doesn't sit in Azure IP, it actually sits in SharePoint. And when we jump into the SharePoint demo, I'll show you how that works. It's got its own section where you configure the policies, and it works differently to the way rudimentary Azure Information Protection comes. And then to add more confusion to this, for those that have worked with Office 365, you've obviously seen the Security and Compliance Center, and that's extended now to classification labels. And you've got protection there as well. So which ones do you use? Do you configure a policy at a group level in the Azure Information Protection portal? How does that extend to SharePoint? What do you do about it there? Also, if you want to start working with e-discovery, how do you lock down content in Exchange? Do you do it through the Security and Compliance Center? Because there's a whole bunch of information around DLP and all of those things. So how do you work with those things? I mean, what functionality do you then extend? And that's always been the concern for when Microsoft releases products. And the fact that everything's sitting in the cloud, it's much easier for them to release products because no one really has to download anything. It's just instantly available as soon as it gets rolled out. So how do you decide where to or what tooling to use to protect content? Do you do it at a file server level, or when people are creating content? Do you do it inside of SharePoint? Do you do it inside of Office 365 so that you can auto-classify content depending on the information stored inside the content? Where do you go? What do you use in order to enable that sort of protection throughout the organization? And that extends to Exchange. You get the same richness as Office Docs, so you can now lock down emails, specific things, not necessarily just attachments, but emails. So I wouldn't say in the old days, but with Exchange Online, you had the e-discovery center through the security and compliance center, because it's all morphed from the old BPOS. And the first thing that Microsoft said was, okay, great, we can now lock down ISBN numbers. I think it was, I can't remember the one, but if you put a credit card into an email, it will lock that down when it came to the protection component, which was neat to have. The nice thing about the Azure Information Protection for Exchange is that you can now lock down replying to all or forwarding. So think about marketing organizations that are busy with mock-ups for an ad that's going out, and someone attaches a PDF or a PowerPoint presentation and it sends it, and there's a disgruntled employee because he or she didn't get the right increase, and now they want to forward that content onto a competitor. You can now lock down the content from an email perspective, where people can't forward mail or forward an attachment based on specific criteria. And yes, e-discovery still exists, so you can look at transgressions that have happened in your organization when people have sent mail and you didn't catch it. So it's still there. And also with Azure IP, it extends to both documents and content inside of documents as well as email content. So the body or the subject of your email message that you're about to send out is also locked down. I think that covers Exchange. I haven't seen any questions come through, but if you have, drop some questions into the chat window, stop me, and I will address your questions as soon as possible, as humanly possible in the session. So from a configuration protection perspective, how do we go about configuring this? How do we spin up Azure Information Protection? Well, for starters, you need to enable rights management services, and that's actually done through your old RMS portal or your old Azure portal. I'll show you that in a bit. Once you've enabled it, you'll have the new features for Azure Information Protection. You create a policy, you add a label, you set a permission for the label. You've got various functionalities around that, around content exploration, which is quite a neat feature. And also the one that I'm really interested in is offline access duration. So think about using OneDrive where you've synced content, or you've got content stored in your OneDrive personal. Some users might upload that to their personal OneDrive and not their company OneDrive. The policy is still enforced, and if that is not synced back, there's an offline access because it's seen as offline. You can work with that content offline now, and the content will actually expire based on a duration. I don't know if anyone's worked with Adobe Enterprise Suite. They had what they call the policy server, same functionality. So you can set the duration and the expiration for content that you're working with in very much the same fashion that you'd be able to do it with Azure, with Adobe Policy Server, where you can lock down content, which was quite neat. Also, it extends internally as well as externally. So if you're mailing a customer, you can lock down that content so that the customer can't forward it on or edit the content or copy paste content out of it, because the policy is actually embedded into the document itself, which is nice because that's really what you want. The Adobe Policy Server, and I'm hoping that Microsoft will extend the functionality where you can recall a document or enforce that when a user clicks on the document, that it actually checks the latest policy applied to the document or that the document subscribes to. And the reason why I say that is, if you're in a sales-focused organization and you create a quote and you're emailing the quote to the customer, but instead of 500, you've put 50 as the cost of the item, and you've just realized that, oh gosh, fiddlesticks, I can't say shit. Can I say shit? I think I can say shit. I need to revoke that quote because the quote is valid for 7 days and it's typically binding because you've quoted at that value. You can now, when the customer opens the document, it will go and download the latest version of that document so that you could change that. So we're hoping that through user voice, we'll get that functionality. Also, the different permissions that you have, we've spoken about that. I like the reply all and forward from an email context, and that works quite well. And obviously, once you've created the policy, you have to publish it. And what's nice about these policies, the minute you open up Word, it automatically goes in, grabs the latest Azure Information policies that have been published immediately, and it's made available instantaneously, which is quite neat. So that's some cool functions. I think I've been speaking for about 30 minutes now, so I'm going to jump straight into a demo, and it's going to follow the same order that we were following early on. So let me just open up this window and drag it across so that you can see what's going on here. I think everyone can see my screens. Yes, no?
Yep, it's still coming through.
Okay, great. So let's start at the beginning. Everyone knows and are used to the Microsoft Azure portal. This is the one that you generally see. So if we go look at services, you've got to scroll down quite a bit. Well, I'm scrolling up. So these are the two functions that you're actually looking at. So rights management services, or rights RMS. The first thing you need to do is actually enable that. And when I click on it, it's going to take you to your old Windows Azure portal. And as you can see, I've got my directory. And if you click on rights management, this one is already enabled. And you can see that it's actually active. So if I wanted to change that, there are a few things there, but like you see with most things, Microsoft will tell you to go use the new portal.microsoft or portal, the new portal.azure.com. So once you've enabled it, give it a bit of time, and you'll be able to go back into your Azure portal and actually start configuring all these great labels and policies. Bearing in mind not to be confused with Azure AD Identity Protection. It's very different to that, or privileged identity management. So once the feature's enabled, you'll be able to have a look at policies that are created for the organization, because everything's a policy. So you give it a name. I've created one for the CVG for pass right now, and generally all things start with a policy. So a policy gives you the sensitivity type of information that you're looking for, and each policy will have a corresponding label. Added to that, the policy you can create will depend on where you deploy it. So if I look at a new policy, I can actually decide where I want to deploy it to, and if it's global or if it's not global. I'm hoping everyone can see my screen around that. And then also what the title is of the policy. And it's nice to give it some naming convention so that people can see that, and you'll see that naming convention actually pull through from a label perspective when you look at it inside of your Office clients that you utilize. So give it a name, also give it a description to see which groups it actually enables. So in this case, if you want to use it at a group level, you have to have groups email enabled. I'm actually just going to look at the one that I've created. So if you look at highly confidential, you'll be able to see it's for all employees, and also you've got some other rich functionality there. Added to that, you can also enforce policies in your organization. So all documents that are created by your organization and all emails must have a specific policy applied. I don't know if that's the level of strictness that you actually want to go with, but you do have the functionality to switch it off or switch it on. In this case, I'm not going to do that. And you can also select the default label for all documents, which is nice. If you want to enforce specific headers and footers, so confidentiality statements, you can go and do that. What's nice is if someone wants to create a document without a policy, they can actually request justification to put it on a lower classification label. And also another cool functionality is by applying it to email messages. You can either have that automatic or just on documents, or what the recommended classification schema or labeling would be based on content and the body of the email. So I'm going to grab the one that I've created and just talk you through that. So this is the one that I've enabled. It's a policy or a label that is now enabled. Once you've enabled it, you can select, do you want to protect it or do you just want to classify the document? Remember in the session we spoke about classification versus protection. So you can classify documents being created as confidential, non-confidential, but you don't necessarily have to enforce protection of it so that it can't be copy-pasted or anything like that. So depending on the level of strictness that you have in your organization, you have that feature set available. And when you enable protection, you now start talking to Azure Rights Management Services, which is the old one, which is quite neat. What I do like about Azure IP is that you've got visualizations coming through. So when you create the document, you can add a header text, you can change the font size, you can also add color to it, there's alignment around that, you can also have a footer, and my personal favorite is the watermark diagonally across the entire document. Added to that, you can add some conditions. So if it's got a credit card number, this would be a condition that you can add. There's a couple of templates available. Also, the templates that are available is region specific. So if we look at this one, you've got a US Social Security number, which in South Africa we don't have. It's the same in Europe. So you can also work with that, and also your IBAN. So I don't know if that extends, if that's the same as the SWIFT codes in South Africa, but you can start saying, well, if this document contains a credit card number or an IBAN number, block the content, which is quite neat. So you can apply conditions to applying the specific label. I'm just going to take that edit out. And the one I do want to talk to is the actual RMS policies. And this is where I get really excited about stuff. You've got two protection settings here. You've got Azure RMS, which is the default one. The other one is have your own key. So everyone talks about encryption keys and all of those things. If you have your own encryption key, bring it along, like bring your own device, have your own key. You can now utilize your own encryption key when protecting content in the organization. In this case, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to use the default one. So let's just change this. So if we look at creating new permissions, instead of using the default predefined template, what's nice is you can start saying, well, I want to add permissions depending on the type of user in the organization. So if it's view only, if you look at the various permission levels, they can view content, they can reply and reply all, but they can't forward. So if you only want the user to view the content, consume it, and approve a specific thing, okay, I'm happy with the budget, I can't change it, but I want to say approved in a mail, you can now do that. You can also create groups or select groups in your organization that these things specifically apply to. And that would be your, in this case, you can actually see that it pulls through all the groups I've created, including Office 365 groups. So these ones are Office 365 groups that I've created. So you get that richness coming through from Office 365 as well. And then the typical one. So this is the Office 365 group that I created when I created the SharePoint site, which you'll see in a bit. You can also extend it, and it will also extend it to any hybrid groups that you are running, as well as Azure AD groups. So that's neat functionality. So if a user creates an Office 365 group and they've got external users in there, it filters all the way through to external users as well. But this, for me, is the biggest value add when it comes to using Azure Information Protection. It's about adding permissions to content, and you've got the various levels set here. Obviously, co-owner would have full rights, co-author, you can define your own ones. I can change those ones and create custom permissions for presets, which is quite neat. I'm just going to close this one. And then obviously when it comes to grab the URL for your AD RMS cluster, and that will actually grab your on-premise AD RMS where your encryption keys will be housed, and you can actually consume it that way, which is quite neat. All right, and once the policy is enabled, you'll actually see how it gets consumed, and I'll just drag my deck across. So what you see on the top here, let me just kill the animation panes. What you actually see here is the sensitivity levels. And once again, Microsoft should have just called it a label, not a sensitivity. And if I say file new, I'm just going to, and also what's quite neat is while you can look at protecting here, and there are some of the other labels that come through, and note there's that label, or at creation time, where did my mouse go? If I say file new blank presentation, you'll notice that I actually have the functionalities there. So if I click on past demo, which is the group, you'll see that it gives you the confidential section as well as the headers and the footers that have come through. So that's quite neat to have, and it's now embedded in the document. So let's save this to a library. You can actually put some text in as IP demo, and I'm just going to save it to that specific library, which is the SharePoint library, so you'll see how it moves across. Okay, so that is now saved into a SharePoint library, which is actually synced with my OneDrive sync client, and the one that actually works, the groove.exe. So if you look at the permission levels, it's quite neat. You can actually see it, and that's at a document, at an object level. So it's quite neat to have that at that level. So if I go and have a look at where that document is, so let's just move over to the Office 365 group that I have that would have created a team site. And if I update this page, it would have added that document to the document library. You can actually see it there. Oh, that one over there. And if I open it, and now you can see that it's actually locked down with, once again, Microsoft calling it IRM, because I didn't allow Office to open it in the browser. So now it will take me to on-premise and it will open the document, which is quite neat. Okay, so if we go back, so that's how to embed protection to a document. And if we look at it here, this is the old OneDrive for Business Sync client. But what you do have is but you've got that cool classify and protect feature here, which should launch the Azure Information Protection client that you've just downloaded. The file's open. Okay, let's just close the file and try that again. And boom, you get the same richness here. So at a file server level, you can do this. It's not specific to OneDrive. This you can actually apply to file servers. And the cool thing is you've got more feature richness here. And you can see how this pulls all the information through from Azure Information Protection. And those are the labels that we talk about. And I think we've got 9 minutes left. So this is a library that actually sits inside of SharePoint that's synced with OneDrive. And I just uploaded a document. Well, I saved it from PowerPoint into that library, which, well, not directly into the library. Well, yes, directly into the library. And I use the OneDrive sync client to show me it in Windows Explorer. So that's not to worry about that. So for the SharePoint people on the call, if we actually go look at the library settings and look at information rights management, not to be confused with classification labels, this is how you configure IRM for SharePoint. It grabs, and if we go to the enablement section in your admin panel in SharePoint, if you scroll down a little bit further down, you can actually see, use the IRM service specific for your configuration. This actually consumes Azure Information Protection's RMS service, which you enabled in the old Azure portal. And once you hit the refresh button, it will be available for you to do stuff with. So that's how you integrate Azure Information Protection, which is the old RMS server, inside of SharePoint. And once that's enabled, you now have a different tab, that one over there, and it gives you this functionality instead of the old one, the information management policy tab that you have. And as you can see, it doesn't pull through any of the Azure IP labels that are created in Azure IP. So in this case, I want to restrict library content when it gets downloaded. And remember we said restrict permissions on this library on download. You can give it a name. And the other features is I can also now block documents that do not support. I can also apply a time limit to the restrictions, and then also you get some of the richness there. So you allow viewers to print, run a script, using the snipping tools and all of those. And that's the feature protection that you have there. And you can also do it on a group level. So like I said earlier on, it's completely different to Azure Information Protection, but it uses rights management services that's part of Azure Information Protection when you put it into SharePoint. I think that's it for the demos. Last but not least, you can also create labels in the Security Compliance Center in Office 365, which is completely different to the security as well as the DLP policies that you apply from Azure Information Protection and Azure IP. So I think it's time to wrap up. We've gone through the demo, so let's just resume Death by PowerPoint. We've gone through configuration. My biggest issue with Azure IP is that, so whatever the mobile device I have, I can either download the Word document or the protected document to it, walk to a photostat machine and make a copy of it. Or I can take a picture of it displayed on my screen, because we all have mobile devices with cameras on them. So it doesn't matter. It's great that you can lock it down, but I have a camera on a smartphone that will take a picture of it, and then after taking a picture with it, I'll OCR the content so I can extract the text anyway. So it doesn't matter anymore. And I know that's bursting your bubble, but yeah. Also, the new Sync client doesn't support IRM. The Microsoft is talking about that we'll have conversations around that at Ignite for those that are going to Ignite. The IRM stuff doesn't sit, the ones that sit inside SharePoint is not the same as the Azure RM policies. Understanding classification versus protection. People that are working with Azure IP will have to understand the difference and what you can protect and what you can't protect. And also what to do with protected content once it's protected. The other thing is, do I do it at a library level? Do I do it at an object level? Or do I do it at a DLP level? Which is my bugbear. So where, how, what tooling do you use? So my closing comments around this, the stuff that I really do like is the header, footer, and watermarks. That's great. I also like the have your own key. Companies are kind of sticklers around that. We don't want Microsoft to, we don't want to use their stuff because our passwords are sit in the cloud, and Microsoft has access to our passwords. That's a Rhodesian accent, by the way, for the locals that are on the call. I also like the keywords. So now you can say if they're using words that you don't want them to use in a document, lock it down. So that's very important. What my dislikes are the naming conventions. Microsoft needs to fix that and quickly, because there's an entire post around what is Office Information Protection, and it shouldn't be confused with rights management services or Azure Active Directory rights management or information rights management, because you can see in SharePoint it's still called IRM and not RMS, which is what it is. And I don't like the fact that SharePoint cannot consume those policies unless they've changed it in the last couple of days. It's still, SharePoint's got its own IRM policy creation component, and it's at a library level. I want to consume the policies created in Azure IP. And yes, the new Sync client's not supported yet. So if you've rolled out Windows 10 and it's shipped with the next generation OneDrive Sync client, your users are not going to be able to sync libraries or anything that has Azure Information Protected content enabled because it's not supported yet. You'd have to now run a policy that's going to push down group.exe and uninstall OneDrive.exe. And yes, you still have to download the client. So if you provision a new notebook, make sure that your GPO or a new PC, make sure that your GPO, that you've got a group policy that will push down the MSI for the Azure IP client so that you can actually roll this out. Last but not least, the richness that you got out of retention, because there's retention policies associated with your classification labels inside of Azure IP. It's not like when a document expires, you can do something with it. It's not multi-staged. So it's not like when a document expires, you want to notify someone that this document will expire, so what happens to that document? What happens to the protection enabled on that? So there's no multi-stage initiations on content that actually expires. You can't say, well, if this document expires after a year, initiate a workflow and notify someone that they need to do something with it. It doesn't have that. You have that functionality in SharePoint with information management or the information, no, I'm confused. The information policies that you can apply to a document when it comes to a retention stage. That's what it is. And last but not least, even for me, it's confusing to educate a customer on which to use when. So do I put it at an Azure IP level, at a document level, and let users apply it at randomly, or do I do it as classification labels in Office 365, which extends to OneDrive and Exchange and SharePoint? Or do I just use SharePoint Document Library's IRM policy functionality? It's always the tricky thing. Like I said, the resources are available in the slide deck, and I'm sure Jason will either circulate the slide deck or upload it to SlideShare or something. I'm not too sure how it works. But there's a specific slide around how the naming conventions work for it. And last but not least, thank you for listening to me, everyone that's been on the call, and I'm sure we'll chat to everyone soon on the top of the hour.
That's all right. Thanks a lot here today, Alistair. So with that, let me take a look to double check, see if there's no other questions that have come in. No, the only question we had to come in had something to do with audio early on. So looks like we are good for today. Thank you.
All right, perfect.
And with that,
Pleasure,
I'm going to close out the session here and stop the recording.